Now let's look at the period from 1949 to 1958. Mao is by this point, the undisputed leader of the People's Republic of China. For all intents and purposes, a new nation that is built on the ideals of communism. And the Soviets are supporting this movement. They had already supported Mao in the war, the Chinese Civil War, to bring about victory. And now they're going to continue to provide him both financial and technical support to build this new communist society. They'll adopt a dual party state structure similar to the Soviets, meaning that you're going to have the Communist Party, which will be the supreme body and the leader, chairman of the Communist Party. Mao will be the supreme leader. And then there'll be the state, which is kind of the administrative wing. The state will be responsible for implementing the agenda of the party. They will use the nomenklatura system. Remember, nomenklatura means named positions, lists of names. And this is what the Soviets used to identify the most important positions in the economy and make sure there was a communist representative in all of them. The analogy to the nomenclatura system would be, imagine in the US where we have decentralized government. Imagine that the president could appoint people not just to his cabinet, but he could appoint the governors of states. He could appoint the mayors of cities. He could appoint the city councilmen. He could appoint the CEOs of the big companies, right? He could appoint the directors of the various school districts and colleges. Well, that would centralize authority in the hands of the national government and grant significant power to the leadership, something Mao wants and needs. He's going to adopt the planning cycle that the Soviets use, 5-year cycle, and the first one is scheduled to begin in 1953. A lot of the preliminary changes from 49 to 53 are just preparation for the first cycle. And that involves things like collectivizing land. The private property rights were eliminated. Most of China at this time is agrarian, and people are using their own land to produce product for markets. But the property rights, in order for them to have any real meaning, have to be defended by government. Mao chooses not to defend private property rights and instead collectivizes property. He does, however, take property from the richer classes, the landlords and the peasants that have a lot of land, and distribute it to the poorer classes. This sounds virtuous, and it makes sense because he had just won a revolution with the support of a large mass of poor classes that want to better their standard of living through a strong leader. But eventually, the land is going to be confiscated from them as well. Industry is also nationalized during this period, meaning that the government effectively seizes control over all businesses. And this occurs at every stage of production, from the crudest stage, extracting iron out of the ground, oil out of the ground, that kind of thing, all the way to the retail stage, where a final good is coming off the assembly line. This nationalization requires that the government find a method of production, and they use the same method that the Soviets use. They're going to create technical coefficients that will determine how inputs are converted into outputs, kind of a recipe for production. How much flour does it take to make a loaf of bread? The technocrats in government will determine what that relationship is, and that will be the standard for producing bread. And they'll do the same thing with steel, producing cars, and so on and so forth. You'll notice, in effect, they're taking control of the supply side of the economy. In a market system, technical coefficients would be determined by each individual business owner. How they want to organize inputs into output would be up to them. But in this model, the government is the sole business. And so they have to come up with these technical coefficients for the economy. They're not just taking control of the supply side of the economy, they're also taking control of the demand side. The production is occurring based on what the government wants. If the government wants more cars, then they will produce more cars. If they want more bread, then they will produce more bread. You'll notice that the individual supplier and demander are both removed from the decision-making process and replaced with government decision-making, central planning. But they're still subject to the same resource constraints that a market is. Scarcity is ever present, whether government is in charge of the allocation or buyers and sellers are in charge of the allocation. The point is that there will be times where, for one reason or another, the demand for a particular good will be different than the supply. That is, there will be an imbalance between the two. Maybe a surplus, maybe they have too much bread relative to what they want, or could be a shortage. Maybe they don't have enough bread relative to what they want. And in those imbalanced situations, you have to have some mechanism for correcting it. Now, in the marketplace, voluntary exchange between buyers and sellers will create prices, market prices, which will change to bring about balance in supply and demand. If there is a surplus of bread, that is, there was more bread made than what people want to demand, then prices would go down and that imbalance would go away, would diminish. But if the government has centrally planned the economy, there are no market price changes to bring this correction about. So the government has to initiate a change in the material balance system, meaning that they would need to, in the next cycle, either choose to demand less bread or find a way to increase the supply of bread. But this takes place administratively rather than automatically in the market. And that's why you have these planning cycles, right? Every 5 years, they have to review what success they had with the previous technical coefficients and the material balances and adjust it accordingly to meet whatever goals they have. In addition, the government takes control over prices and wages. And it's important to distinguish between market prices and wages versus government set prices and wages. They're not the same thing. I mean, prices and wages are just numbers stamped on various inputs and outputs. But that doesn't mean that they're created by the same mechanism. Think of the market for, say, rental housing in New York. And let's say that there is currently a shortage. Well, market prices would rise to correct that shortage. However, in some parts of New York, historically, the government would not allow this to happen. They use what's called rent control, which is a government set price. It's not the same thing as a market price because it's not going to move based on market conditions, surpluses and shortages. It's going to move only based on administrative conditions, government. So if there is a shortage of housing under price controls, then government might have to correct that through its own production of housing. And that's why in New York you see public housing as a remedy for the shortage. But this is a micro example of central planning in a predominantly market-based system, New York City. Mao has taken control of all industries. It's not just the housing sector where he's controlling prices and producing public housing. It's the auto industry. It's the steel industry. It's the agricultural industry. It's everything. The important thing to note is if the government controls prices and wages, then they inevitably control the economy. And that means they can set priorities as they choose. For example, if the government wants people to let's say, buy less corn, then they would raise the price of corn administratively, and people would get less corn. If they wanted people to buy more rice, then they could lower the price of rice, and people would buy more rice. They can adjust prices, government set prices, to get people to change their consumption desires in alignment with what the government thinks is best. The same thing occurs with wages. Wages are what the people get for their time, right? For their labor. So if the government says, well, we're going to raise the wage of people working in the industrial sector, then a lot of people will go and try to get jobs in the industrial sector. And we're going to lower the wages in the agricultural sector, then a lot of people will leave agriculture. So if the government controls wages and prices, they control the economy, which is what they need in order to ensure that they're achieving the goals of the Communist Party, which at this time is going to be prioritizing industry over farming. They're using the same model that Stalin used, which is to ramp up your industrial sector, one, to create a strong national defense, and two, to become more competitive internationally. Both factors help solidify a leader's longevity and influence. Another thing that emerged in this period is the hukou system. Officially imposed in 1958, it was a residency permitting system that registered households based on their urban or rural location. Kind of, where is your family from in this large geography of China? That's where you're going to be registered. Once registered, people would be restricted in moving from those locations. Now, the hukou system was put into place in large part because of a lack of market forces. What the government is doing during this period is they're incentivizing people to gravitate towards the industrial sector and away from farming. That means they purposely set wages higher in industry in the cities than in the farming sector. So what do people do? They're all going to go to the city. Now, if this were a market system, of course, as more workers went into the cities, you would see wages drop, and it would stop that momentum of people moving out of the farming sector. But there's no market prices, no market wages. And as a result, once the government sets the wages higher in, say, Beijing than in the farming regions, people are going to go to Beijing, and they're going to have too many workers in industry and not enough in agriculture. So the government has to institute the hukou system, which limits people's ability to move. And this is enforced not only through punitive measures. I mean, you're not allowed to reside somewhere other than where you're permitted. It also is enforced through access to goods and services. You're relying on the government for your housing, for your food, for your education, for your health care. The government controls the economy. They control what is available, and they ration it to you. Clearly, you're not going to be able to get it if you're not permitted. It's analogous to being an undocumented immigrant in your own country. Without legality, you wouldn't have access to the government provisions. But let's keep in mind the rationale behind this. For the government to control the production of goods and services in the economy, they have to control the inputs that are used to produce those goods and services, right? They got to control inputs and outputs. They do this through collectivizing land and industry, nationalizing industry, but they also do it through managing labor. And that seems like a personal violation, which it may well be from a moral standpoint. But from a practical standpoint for the leaders, it's a necessity. And another example of property rights being moved from private individuals to the government. In this case, it just happens to be property rights of labor. All right, we'll pick up in the next video. Thanks.